Welcome back to another episode where we explore pivotal moments that shaped the world as we know it. Today's focus is on a military engagement that fundamentally changed the balance of global power and sealed the destiny of an emerging nation. The Battle of Yorktown. In the fall of 1781, a combined force of 17,000 French and American troops encircled and ultimately defeated 8,000 British soldiers in a siege that showcased masterful naval tactics, powerful artillery, and remarkable international cooperation. This wasn't just another battle, it was the moment when America's fight for independence shifted from a seemingly hopeless rebellion to an undeniable reality. Before we dive deeper into this compelling historical narrative, I have a small request. If you value quality educational content about history, please consider subscribing to our channel. Also, drop a comment letting us know what time you're watching this. Your engagement helps us grow and reach more history enthusiasts like yourself. Now, let's journey back to that critical autumn of 1781. To truly appreciate what transpired at Yorktown, we must first examine the wider circumstances of the American Revolutionary War. By this point, the conflict had already stretched across 6 exhausting years. What started as colonial resistance against taxation and lack of representation had evolved into full-scale armed warfare between the 13 colonies and the British Empire, which was then the most formidable military and naval power on Earth. After declaring independence in 1776, the American colonists under General George Washington's command experienced a series of both triumphs and setbacks, leaving the war's outcome perpetually uncertain. The British forces, led by some of Europe's most seasoned military commanders, implemented a strategy centered on controlling major coastal cities and leveraging their naval dominance to rapidly deploy troops along the American shoreline. Their assumption was that by maintaining control over urban centers and commercial routes, they would eventually crush the uprising and restore colonial authority. However, this approach severely miscalculated both the resolve of the American revolutionaries and the sheer size of the territory. Washington's Continental Army, despite being frequently outnumbered and poorly equipped, demonstrated extraordinary resilience and achieved surprising victories at crucial junctures, such as Trenton and Princeton. France's involvement in 1778 dramatically altered the conflict's trajectory. Still stinging from their defeat in the 7 Years' War that concluded in 1763, the French recognized the American Revolution as a golden opportunity to weaken their British adversaries and restore their international standing. The Franco-American partnership brought not only experienced French military forces, but, critically, the naval capability needed to challenge Britain's maritime supremacy. This would prove essential for the victory at Yorktown. Spain and the Dutch Republic also entered the conflict against Britain, transforming what began as a colonial uprising into a war with worldwide implications. By early 1781, the military situation had reached a deadlock. In the Northern Territories, American and British forces maintained largely defensive positions around New York, which remained firmly under British control. The Southern theater was more fluid and concerning for the Americans. British forces had seized Savannah and Charleston and seemed to be advancing in Georgia and the Carolinas. The British commander in the South, Lord Charles Cornwallis, was both aggressive and skilled. Having secured several victories against American forces, Cornwallis believed he could bring the South under control and then advance northward, reclaiming colony after colony until the rebellion was completely suppressed. Throughout the spring and summer of 1781, Cornwallis pursued a vigorous military campaign across the Carolinas. Though it exacted a heavy toll, his forces faced constant harassment from local militias and Continental Army units led by exceptional commanders like Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan. The Battle of Cowpens in January 1781 resulted in a substantial British defeat, while the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in March, though technically a British victory, cost Cornwallis nearly a quarter of his forces. As Cornwallis himself would later reflect, few more such victories and his army would cease to exist. Exhausted and with diminished forces, Cornwallis made a critical decision. he chose to march into Virginia, hoping to establish a secure naval base where he could receive supplies and reinforcements by sea. His directives from British Commander-in-Chief Sir Henry Clinton in New York were vague, but Cornwallis interpreted them as granting him operational freedom. He selected the small village of Yorktown, situated on a peninsula between the York and James Rivers in Virginia. Yorktown appeared to be a sound choice. It featured a deep harbor and occupied a position that theoretically could be easily defended and resupplied by the Royal Navy. Cornwallis arrived at Yorktown in August 1781 with roughly 8,000 troops. He immediately set about fortifying the location, constructing redoubts, trenches, and artillery positions. Across the York River at Gloucester Point, he established a smaller garrison to secure water access. Cornwallis felt confident that with British naval superiority, his position was virtually unassailable. He believed he could withstand any land siege until reinforcements arrived by sea. This confidence, however, was about to be severely tested while Cornwallis fortified Yorktown. George Washington was in New York contemplating his next strategy. Washington had spent months considering an assault on New York, the jewel of British holdings in America. However, when he learned that Cornwallis was isolated at Yorktown and that a substantial French fleet under Admiral Francois, Joseph Paul de Grasse, was approaching the Virginia coast, Washington recognized an opportunity too significant to ignore. If he could rapidly move his army southward, and if the French Navy could dominate the waters around Yorktown, Cornwallis would be completely trapped. Washington's decision was ingenious but extremely hazardous. Transporting thousands of soldiers hundreds of miles through hostile or neutral territory while maintaining operational secrecy from the British in New York demanded exceptional coordination, logistics, and fortune. Washington collaborated closely with his French counterpart, Count Rochambeau, who commanded a well-equipped French force of approximately 5,000 soldiers stationed in Rhode Island. Together, they crafted a clever strategy. Washington deliberately maintained some troops near New York and conducted maneuvers suggesting an imminent attack on the city. This kept Clinton and his British forces tied down, preventing them from dispatching reinforcements to Cornwallis without leaving New York vulnerable. Meanwhile, the main Franco-American force, totaling about 7,000 soldiers, began their southern march in late August. They moved swiftly, traversing New Jersey and then Philadelphia, where the local population received them enthusiastically. The march exemplified military logistics at its finest. The soldiers required food, shelter, and maintenance of good marching order, while covering over 300 kilometers in under 3 weeks. Upon reaching Chesapeake Bay in early September, Washington and Rochambeau received vital intelligence. Admiral de Grasse's fleet had arrived and was blockading the bay's entrance. Even more significantly, on September 5th, the French fleet had engaged and defeated a British relief fleet commanded by Admiral Thomas Graves at the Battle of the Chesapeake. This naval engagement, while not decisive in terms of vessels destroyed, was absolutely critical strategically. The British were compelled to return to New York for repairs, leaving Cornwallis completely cut off. Without control of the sea, there would be no rescue for the British forces at Yorktown. Washington realized he now had Cornwallis in a strategic trap from which escape would be extremely difficult. American and French forces converged on Yorktown from multiple directions. Beyond the troops who had marched from New York, there were contingents from Virginia and other southern states, including local militias familiar with the terrain. Admiral de Grasse also disembarked another 3,000 French soldiers from his fleet. When the entire Allied army assembled around Yorktown at the end of September, it numbered approximately 17,000 soldiers, more than double Cornwallis's strength. The Americans and French enjoyed substantial numerical superiority, a significant advantage rarely seen by revolutionary forces throughout the war. The Siege of Yorktown formally commenced on September 28, 1781. Washington and Rochambeau established their command posts and initiated the systematic process of completely surrounding the British position. Cornwallis had constructed a series of redoubts and fortifications around Yorktown. but his defensive perimeter was too expansive to be adequately manned by 8,000 soldiers, particularly considering he also needed to garrison Gloucester. Point across the river, the Allies began excavating trenches and positioning artillery, adhering to classical siege warfare principles that had been refined over centuries of European conflict. The first trench line was dug at a safe distance from British defenses, beyond the effective range of their cannons. This was a massive undertaking involving thousands of soldiers digging through the night, moving enormous quantities of earth to create protective parapets against enemy fire. The coordination between American and French forces was exceptional. The French, with their extensive tradition of siege warfare, provided technical expertise and skilled engineers. The Americans, though less experienced in formal siege operations, compensated with determination and local terrain knowledge. During the siege's early days, occasional skirmishes occurred when British troops ventured from their fortifications to probe Allied defenses or when scouts from both sides encountered each other. Cornwallis dispatched several urgent messages to Clinton in New York, desperately requesting reinforcements and relief. Clinton responded with assurances that a rescue force was being organized. But in reality, the military and naval situation made such a rescue extremely challenging, if not impossible. The French fleet continued to control Chesapeake Bay, and Clinton lacked sufficient land forces to mount an effective rescue operation without jeopardizing New York. On October 9th, the Allies had completed their first trench line and were prepared to commence artillery bombardment. Washington, in a symbolic gesture, personally fired the opening cannon. What ensued was one of the war's most intense and sustained bombardments. The French had transported heavy siege artillery, including mortar and large-caliber cannons, capable of launching devastating projectiles against British fortifications. The Americans had also assembled considerable artillery. Combined, the Allies possessed over 100 artillery pieces, continuously bombarding Yorktown. The effect on British defenses and troop morale was devastating. The bombardment continued relentlessly, day and night, destroying fortifications and structures where soldiers and civilians had sheltered during the siege. The British returned fire with their own artillery, but were clearly outmatched, and their positions were being systematically dismantled. Cornwallis attempted to conserve ammunition and troops, recognizing that each loss further compromised his defensive capability. He continued hoping that somehow relief would arrive before the situation became completely hopeless. While artillery pounded British defenses, Allied engineers worked on the second trench line, which would be excavated even closer to British fortifications. This operation was more hazardous because the trenches would be within effective range of British muskets and light artillery. Soldiers digging these trenches faced constant danger, working primarily at night to minimize exposure to enemy fire. The second trench line was completed on October 11th, further demonstrating the Allied forces' efficiency and determination. However, two British redoubts, known as Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10, stood outside the main British defensive line and needed to be captured before the Allies could advance further. These redoubts were heavily fortified and defended by some of Cornwallis's finest troops. Washington determined they would need to be taken by direct assault. This would become one of the siege's most dramatic and dangerous moments. Washington assigned the assault on Redoubt 10 to French forces under Baron de Villementel's command, while the attack on Redoubt 9 was entrusted to the Americans commanded by the young and ambitious Alexander Hamilton. On the night of October 14th, both attacks launched simultaneously. Hamilton had pleaded with Washington for the opportunity to lead the American attack, viewing it as a chance to earn military glory. Washington, recognizing both the operation's importance and Hamilton's leadership capabilities, consented. American and French troops removed their musket flints to prevent accidental discharges that might alert the British prematurely. They would advance with bayonets, relying on speed and courage. Hamilton's assault on Redoubt 10 was executed with remarkable precision and valor. The Americans approached the redoubt silently through darkness, using axes to hack through palisades and obstacles the British had erected. When finally detected, they charged rapidly forward. The engagement was brief but fierce. with fighting occurring in darkness. The British defenders, outnumbered and surprised, fought courageously but were quickly overwhelmed. In less than 10 minutes, Redoubt 10 fell to American hands. Hamilton had achieved a crucial objective with relatively minimal casualties. Simultaneously, French forces attacked Redoubt 9. They encountered more determined resistance and slightly stronger fortifications. But their military experience and discipline prevailed. The engagement was intense, with soldiers fighting in darkness. But eventually the French also accomplished their objective: the capture of both redoubts. On the same night dealt a severe blow to Cornwallis. His outer defenses had been penetrated, and now the Allies could position their artillery even closer, making the British position virtually untenable. Cornwallis recognized his options were rapidly diminishing. His fortifications were crumbling, his troops were exhausted and demoralized. Ammunition and supplies were rapidly depleting, and there was no indication of rescue. On October 15th, he attempted one final desperate maneuver. He ordered a surprise night assault against Allied trenches. Hoping to destroy some enemy artillery batteries and gain brief respite, the attack was executed bravely, and British forces managed to spike some Allied guns before being forced to withdraw. However, it provided only temporary relief. Allied engineers quickly repaired the damaged artillery, and the bombardment resumed with even greater intensity. Cornwallis then contemplated a desperate escape. His plan involved evacuating his troops overnight, crossing the York River to Gloucester Point, where they could attempt to break through the smaller siege lines and escape into the Virginia countryside. It was an extremely risky plan with minimal chance of success, but Cornwallis felt any chance was preferable to surrender. On the night of October 16th, he began transferring troops across the river in boats. However, fate intervened in the form of a sudden violent storm. Strong winds and turbulent waters made continuing the evacuation impossible. The boats were scattered, and some troops who had already crossed needed to be brought back. By morning, it was evident the escape attempt had completely failed. On the morning of October 17, 1781, exactly 4 years after the American victory at Saratoga that had convinced France to enter the war, Cornwallis acknowledged there was nothing more he could do. His troops were exhausted, his defenses were compromised, and continuing the fight would be futile. He dispatched an officer with a white flag to Allied lines, requesting a cessation of hostilities to discuss surrender terms. When the messenger emerged from British fortifications, British drummers played a parley call, the traditional signal for negotiations. The bombardment ceased, and silence fell over the battlefield after days of continuous artillery fire. Negotiations for surrender terms commenced immediately. Cornwallis hoped to secure honorable terms for his soldiers, possibly including permission to return to Britain on parole, not to fight again. Washington, remembering the harsh terms the British had imposed on Americans after Charleston's fall in 1780, insisted on terms reflecting the military reality. The British had been decisively defeated and were not in a position to negotiate. After some negotiation, terms were agreed upon. British troops would surrender as prisoners of war. Their weapons and equipment would be handed over, and they would not receive the honors of war traditionally granted to garrisons that had defended themselves valiantly. On October 19, 1781, the formal surrender ceremony took place. It was an event charged with symbolism and emotion. British and Hessian troops, some 8,000 soldiers, marched from Yorktown in formation, passing between two lines formed by the victorious army. On one side stood the Americans, many wearing irregular uniforms or civilian clothing, representing the perseverance and determination of a revolutionary cause. On the other side stood the French, resplendent in their immaculate white uniforms, representing European military power and professionalism. Together they had accomplished what seemed impossible just months earlier. Lord Cornwallis, humiliated and possibly ill, claimed to be too indisposed to personally attend the surrender ceremony. He sent his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, to surrender his sword. O'Hara first attempted to offer the sword to Rochambeau, perhaps seeking the dignity of surrendering to a European officer of comparable social standing, but Rochambeau politely declined and indicated Washington. O'Hara then approached Washington, maintaining strict protocol and possibly making his own statement about status and respect, refused to personally accept the sword from a subordinate and instructed O'Hara to present it to his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln, who had been forced to surrender to the British at Charleston. It was a moment of poetic justice. British troops marched to a field where they were instructed to lay down their arms. Contemporary accounts describe many British soldiers as visibly distressed by the outcome. Some displayed their frustration as they relinquished their weapons. The British military bands reportedly played a song called "The World Turned Upside Down," an appropriately ironic title for the moment when the British Empire suffered one of its most significant defeats. The world's most powerful army had been overcome by colonial forces and their European allies. The immediate aftermath of Yorktown's surrender was profound. For Americans, it was a moment of incredible jubilation and relief. After years of uncertain warfare, occasional victories followed by reversals, Yorktown represented a decisive and undeniable victory that fundamentally altered the conflict's momentum. For Washington personally, it was vindication of years of strategy, sacrifice, and leadership under extraordinary pressure. He had maintained the Continental Army's unity through brutal winters, desertions, lack of pay and supplies, and challenging circumstances. Now his patience and persistence had been rewarded with a victory that would make his name synonymous with American leadership. For the French, Yorktown demonstrated that their alliance with the Americans was not merely diplomatic maneuvering, but a genuine and effective military partnership producing tangible results. Rochambeau and de Grasse would return to France as heroes. And France had recovered some military prestige that had been diminished in previous conflicts with Britain. The coordination between French land and naval forces and cooperation with Americans at Yorktown became a case study in joint military operations. In Britain, news of Yorktown's surrender was met with shock and disbelief. When Prime Minister Lord North received the news, he repeatedly expressed dismay about the situation's direction. The defeat of such a substantial British force and loss of thousands of veteran soldiers profoundly impacted British perception of the conflict. The war had become increasingly unpopular in Britain, costly in financial and human terms, and now seemed unlikely to be won on initially planned terms. Political support for continuing the military campaign under previous terms rapidly eroded. It's crucial to understand that Yorktown didn't technically end the American Revolutionary War immediately. Formal hostilities continued for another 2 years, and the British still controlled important port cities like New York, Charleston, and Savannah. However, Yorktown significantly altered British political will to continue an offensive war to suppress the rebellion. Peace negotiations began soon after, though they took considerable time. Lord North's government fell months after Yorktown, replaced by a ministry more willing to recognize American independence. The peace talks in Paris were lengthy and complicated, involving not only Britain and America, but also France, Spain, and the Netherlands, each with their own interests and objectives. The Treaty of Paris was finally signed in September 1783. Formally recognizing the United States of America's independence, the treaty was remarkably generous to Americans, granting them territory stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River and from the Great Lakes to Florida. This vast territory would provide the United States space to grow and expand in subsequent decades. American diplomacy during peace negotiations, led by Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, skillfully balanced French ally interests with American needs, eventually concluding a separate agreement with Britain that guaranteed highly favorable conditions. But let's return to Yorktown and consider why this battle had such decisive impact. Militarily, the Yorktown campaign demonstrated several principles that would become fundamental in modern warfare. First, it illustrated the critical importance of naval superiority in coastal operations. The French fleet's ability to control Chesapeake Bay was absolutely essential to the siege's success. Without this control, Cornwallis might have been resupplied or evacuated. This principle that naval power can determine land campaign outcomes would be demonstrated repeatedly in future conflicts. Second, Yorktown illustrated the importance of coordination between allied forces from different nations. The cooperation between Americans and French, despite differences in language, culture, and sometimes strategic objectives, was remarkable. Washington and Rochambeau developed a working relationship, based on mutual respect and understanding of each other's strengths and limitations. This ability to form and maintain effective coalitions would prove crucial in many subsequent international conflicts. Third, the campaign demonstrated the importance of mobility and strategic speed. Washington and Rochambeau's march from New York to Yorktown, covering hundreds of miles in weeks while maintaining operational secrecy, was an impressive logistical achievement. They concentrated overwhelming force at a crucial point before the enemy could react effectively. This concept of force concentration and rapid movement would become increasingly important in modern warfare. Fourth, Yorktown was a classic example of siege warfare conducted according to well-established principles. The methodical excavation of progressively closer trench lines, coordinated use of heavy artillery, final assault on key strongpoints, all followed patterns developed over centuries of European warfare. The French particularly brought expertise in these techniques. However, the scale and effectiveness with which they were applied at Yorktown were remarkable. From a human perspective, Yorktown was a moment of trial and character revelation for thousands of individuals. For Continental Army soldiers who had endured years of hardship, it was proof their sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Many of these men were ordinary farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who had dedicated their lives to fight for a cause they believed in. They fought not for glory or conquest, but for the idea they had the right to govern themselves. Yorktown validated that belief in their sacrifices. For French soldiers, Yorktown was a chance to fight for principles supporting liberty and independence. Even though their own country was an absolute monarchy, many French officers who fought at Yorktown, including the young Marquise de Lafayette, who had become Washington's close collaborator, were inspired by American revolutionary ideals. Ironically, some would take these ideas back to France, where they would contribute to the French Revolution that would erupt just years later. For the British and their Hessian allies, Yorktown was a difficult defeat to accept. Many were professional soldiers who had served with distinction in previous campaigns. They fought bravely at Yorktown but were overcome by circumstances beyond their control: failure of naval support, lack of timely reinforcements, and enemy numerical superiority. Surrender was particularly painful because they were denied traditional honors of war. Many of these soldiers would remain prisoners of war before eventually returning home. For Lord Cornwallis personally, Yorktown was the low point of an otherwise distinguished military career. He had served bravely in many campaigns and was respected as a commander. His decision to position himself at Yorktown was based on ambiguous orders and reasonable assumptions about naval support that ultimately didn't materialize. He would later criticize Clinton and British leadership in London for failing to provide necessary support. Cornwallis would eventually return to Britain, where, surprisingly, his career wasn't permanently ruined. He would go on to serve in important positions, including as Governor-General of India, demonstrating that while Yorktown was a defeat, it wasn't viewed as resulting from personal incompetence on his part. The broader impact of Yorktown on world history cannot be overstated. The creation of the United States of America as an independent nation set a revolutionary precedent. For the first time, a colony had successfully broken away from a European empire and established a government based on principles of popular representation and individual rights. America's founding fathers created a government system that, while imperfect and contradictory in many respects, particularly regarding slavery, established ideals of liberty, democracy, and self-government that would inspire independence and democratic movements worldwide for centuries. The United States Constitution, ratified years after Yorktown, created a federal government system with separation of powers that would become a model studied and sometimes emulated by other nations. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 constitutional amendments, codified individual liberty protections that influenced rights declarations in many other countries. The American experiment in large-scale democratic republic was closely observed by philosophers, politicians, and revolutionaries throughout Europe and beyond. Yorktown's victory also had significant economic consequences. American independence opened American trade to the entire world, no longer restricted by British mercantilist systems. The United States rapidly developed trade relations with nations worldwide, including former British enemies. The vast territory guaranteed by the Treaty of Paris provided resources and space for expansion that would fuel America's rapid economic growth in following decades. For Britain, losing the 13 colonies was initially seen as catastrophic. But in the long run, the British Empire adapted and continued growing. British attention shifted more toward possessions in India, the Caribbean, and eventually Africa and the Pacific. Lessons learned about colonial treatment would eventually lead to more flexible colonial governance in what would become the British Commonwealth. Ironically, Anglo-American relations, after a period of hostility, would eventually develop into one of the strongest and most enduring alliances in the modern world. For France, success in aiding Americans was sweet but costly. The war's financial burden exacerbated France's fiscal problems, which combined with poor harvests, social inequality, and resentment of the political system would contribute to the French Revolution in 1789. French veterans of Yorktown returned home with ideas about liberty and representation that would challenge the Anzan regime. In a real sense, seeds of the French Revolution were planted in Yorktown's fields. Yorktown also held special significance for the African-American community. Thousands of enslaved people had fled to British lines during the war, attracted by British promises of freedom. These individuals' fate after Yorktown was complicated and often tragic. Some were evacuated by the British to other empire parts, including Canada and Sierra Leone, where they would establish new communities. Others were recaptured and returned to slavery. The contradiction between revolutionary freedom ideals and slavery's continuation in the independent United States would be a moral and political tension eventually leading to the American Civil War 80 years later. Yorktown's legacy also includes leadership lessons drawn from Washington's conduct throughout the campaign. Washington demonstrated strategic patience, waiting for the right opportunity rather than forcing premature action. He showed skill in building and maintaining a coalition, working effectively with French allies despite occasional disagreements. He was bold when necessary, as in his risky march from New York to Yorktown, but also careful in planning and executing operations with precision. His willingness to credit subordinates and allies, while taking personal responsibility for challenges, earned him loyalty and respect. Physical sites associated with Yorktown have become important historical landmarks. Today, Yorktown is part of Colonial National Historical Park, where visitors can walk siege lines, see reconstructed fortifications, visit fields where 1781's dramatic events unfolded. Monuments and markers commemorate sacrifices of soldiers from all involved nations. The site serves as a physical reminder of principles American revolutionaries fought for and the price paid for independence. Yorktown's memory has also been preserved in art, literature, and public commemoration. Paintings of Cornwallis's surrender, including John Trumbull's famous work, have become iconic images in American history. Poems, songs, and later films have told and retold Yorktown's story to new generations. The battle has become part of American founding mythology, a narrative about courage, perseverance, and triumph of a just cause against seemingly insurmountable odds. In broader military context, Yorktown is studied in military academies worldwide as an example of successful combined operations. Coordination between land and naval forces, cooperation between allies, effective use of siege warfare and artillery, and importance of intelligence and operational secrecy are all lessons remaining relevant in modern warfare. The campaign also demonstrates how political and strategic factors can be as important as tactical ones in determining military conflict outcomes. It's also important to acknowledge limitations and complexities of the Yorktown narrative. The war wasn't simply a struggle between two clearly defined sides. There were American loyalists who fought alongside the British, sincerely believing loyalty to the crown was the right course. There were Native Americans who fought on both sides, trying to protect their own lands and interests amid conflict between colonial powers. The enslaved population saw the war as potential opportunity for freedom, but was often disappointed by unfulfilled promises from both sides. Yorktown's victory also didn't solve all problems facing the new nation. the United States would grapple with issues of national unity, states' rights versus federal power, economic policy, and fundamental moral contradictions of slavery for decades after independence. The Constitution, while revolutionary, was a compromise document leaving many issues unresolved. It would take a civil war, civil rights movements, and ongoing constitutional development for the nation to begin fully realizing ideals. It's proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence. Reflecting on Yorktown from a 21st century perspective, we can see both triumphs and challenges of human history. The triumph of people fighting for self-determination and establishing government based on governed consent was genuinely revolutionary and inspiring. Different nations' ability to work together for common cause demonstrated international cooperation's potential. Ordinary individuals' courage and dedication fighting for principles reminds us of human capacity for perseverance. At the same time, we must acknowledge painful aspects of this history. Human losses on both sides. Communities affected by war, native peoples displaced by ensuing American expansion, and millions kept in slavery in a nation founded on liberty principles. The complete story of Yorktown and the American Revolution is complex. It's full of contradictions, but still fundamentally important for understanding the modern world. The Siege of Yorktown lasted only 3 weeks, but its impact echoed through centuries. It was the culmination of years of struggle, sacrifice, determination by ordinary people who dared challenge the world's greatest empire. It was a moment when military strategy, diplomacy, individual courage, and even luck and weather converged to create an outcome that changed history's course. The 17,000 French and American soldiers who besieged Yorktown and the 8,000 British who defended the city participated in an event transcending their own understanding at the time. When the last British troops laid down their arms on October 19, 1781, they weren't merely ending a battle or even a campaign. They were participating in a moment of historical transformation that would help define centuries to come. The idea that ordinary people could govern themselves, that political authority should derive from governed consent. That individual rights should be protected against state power. All these ideas were validated and reinforced by Yorktown's outcome. The Battle of Yorktown teaches us about perseverance's importance in facing seemingly insurmountable adversity. Washington's Continental Army had faced many setbacks, endured harsh winters without adequate supplies, and seen its numbers dwindle through desertion and expired enlistments. However, Washington kept the army united and continued fighting, waiting for the right opportunity. When that opportunity came in 1781, he had the strategic vision, courage, and leadership ability to seize it. Yorktown teaches us about cooperation and alliance value. Neither Washington nor Rochambeau could have won alone. Only through their ability to work together, overcoming differences in language, culture, and sometimes strategic opinion, did they achieve victory. Admiral de Grasse and his fleet were equally essential, demonstrating that success in complex military operations requires coordination between different services and even different nations. Yorktown teaches us about strategic decision consequences. Cornwallis's choice to position himself at Yorktown, based on reasonable but ultimately incorrect assumptions about naval support, had significant and decisive consequences. Washington's decision to march south instead of attacking New York, though risky, was brilliantly executed and changed the war's course. These decisions remind us that in history, individual moments of choice can have disproportionate and lasting impacts. Yorktown also teaches us about changing nature of power and empire. The British Empire in 1781 was the world's undisputed superpower. Its outcomes at Yorktown and subsequent peace treaty didn't end the empire, but demonstrated that even seemingly invincible powers have limits. No empire, no matter how powerful, can indefinitely maintain control over peoples determined to be free. This lesson would be observed repeatedly in subsequent centuries as colonial empires worldwide eventually crumbled, facing national independence movements. As we conclude this journey through Yorktown's events in 1781, we must recognize we're speaking not just of a battle, but of a transformative moment in human history. The military confrontation at Yorktown was intense and consequential. But what emerged from that period was something new to the world. A nation founded not on tradition or conquest, but on ideas of liberty, equality, and self-government. These ideas were imperfect in their initial application, excluding women, enslaved people, and Native Americans from freedom's promises. But once articulated, they took on a life of their own, inspiring future generations to expand upon and fulfill those promises. Yorktown's legacy lives on, not only in the United States, but everywhere. People fight for self-determination, democracy, and human rights. The victory achieved there by 17,000 French and American soldiers over 8,000 British was more than military victory. It was a victory of ideals, of determination, and of belief that ordinary people, when united by a just cause and led with wisdom, can overcome even the most formidable obstacles. This is Yorktown's true meaning, and this is why this battle, fought more than 2 centuries ago, continues to capture our imagination and teach us valuable lessons today. I deeply thank the Lord God for the opportunity to share this historical knowledge, for granting us the ability to learn from the past, and for all blessings we have received. May we use history's lessons to build a more just and peaceful future for all humanity. May the wisdom, courage, and determination demonstrated at Yorktown inspire us to face our own challenges with the same perseverance and commitment to righteous principles.